In 1928, a 22-year-old named Warren Buffett received his first investment book as a gift. He didn't act on it immediately, but when he did, at age 11, that single decision compounded into a net worth north of $100 billion. Most people hear that story and think it's about genius. It isn't. Most people believe building wealth is about the size of the bet. The bigger the risk, the bigger the reward. But the investors, business owners, and professionals who actually pull ahead aren't taking bigger swings. They're running better systems, ones that quietly multiply every hour they work, every dollar they save, every relationship they build. So why does the same income, the same discipline, the same starting point produce such wildly different outcomes over time? The answer is compounding, not just in money, but in every asset you own. Most people apply it to their savings account and stop there. That's what this video is about, because if you only compound one thing, you're leaving the majority of the engine sitting idle. And every year that passes without understanding this costs you more than the last. My name is Alex, and if you've ever felt like you're doing everything right but still falling behind, pay close attention, because the gap usually is an effort, and I'm going to show you the 7 assets that compound, and exactly how they connect into one system. Once you understand how this engine is built, you'll stop optimizing pieces and start running the whole machine. It starts with something most people never think of as an asset at all: their reputation. Nobody puts reputation on their balance sheet, but maybe they should. Think about what a balance sheet actually measures: assets that generate future value. And reputation does exactly that, quietly, continuously, without you having to do anything extra once it's built. The problem is that most people treat it like a soft skill, something nice to have, when it's actually one of the hardest working assets in the entire system. Here's how to think about it. Every time you keep a promise, deliver early, or follow up when nobody asked you to, you make a small deposit. Every time you overpromise, go quiet, or cut corners, you make a withdrawal. The account balance isn't visible on any screen, but the people around you are tracking it in real time, whether they realize it or not. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, but how does that actually compound? Here's the mechanism. A strong reputation reduces friction. It shortens sales cycles. It generates referrals without ad spend. It gets your calls returned first. In a market where trust is increasingly scarce, a reputation for reliability is genuinely rare, and rare things command a premium. Let me give you a concrete example. Take 2 independent contractors, both electricians, both licensed, both charging similar rates in the same city. The first one does solid work, sends an invoice, and moves on. The second one does the same solid work, sends a follow-up text 2 days later to make sure everything is running fine, and asks if there's anything else the homeowner has noticed. One extra message, maybe 90 seconds of his time. A year later, the first electrician is spending roughly $400 a month on local advertising to keep his calendar full. The second one hasn't paid for a single lead in 11 months. His last 14 jobs came from direct referrals. At $400 a month, that's $4,800 a year. The first electrician is spending just to stay even, money that could be sitting in an investment account, compounding on its own. That's not a personality difference. That's a system difference, and systems compound. The uncomfortable truth is that most professionals underinvest in reputation because the return isn't immediate. You send the follow-up, and nothing happens that afternoon. You show up early, and nobody applauds. The feedback loop is slow, so the behavior feels optional. But that's exactly why it compounds, because most people stop doing it. The ones who don't pull away from the field gradually, then all at once. Your reputation is the permission structure for everything else in this system. It determines whether people return your calls, recommend your name, or hand you opportunities before they're posted publicly. Without it, every other asset in this engine works harder than it needs to. And speaking of assets that quietly do the heavy lifting, the next one is one most people think they're already using, but almost nobody is using correctly. It's knowledge, not the collecting of it, the compounding of it. Here's a question worth sitting with. What's the difference between 2 people who read the same book? One of them finishes it, thinks that was interesting, and moves on. The other one closes it, writes 3 sentences summarizing what changed in their thinking, and does one thing differently the next morning. A year later, those 2 people are not in the same place, not even close. And the gap between them wasn't talent, it was a loop. Most people treat knowledge like a collection. They consume books, podcasts, courses, newsletters, and they feel productive doing it. The shelf looks impressive. The listening history is long. But consumption without application is just expensive entertainment. It feels like progress because the input is real. The output never arrives. Here's the mechanism that actually works. It has 3 steps and takes less time than most people spend scrolling before bed. First, study something small every day. Not a chapter, not a course. One concept, one article, one focused idea. Small enough that you actually finish it. Second, summarize it in your own words, not a quote, not a highlight. Your words, 2 or 3 sentences, written down somewhere you'll see again. That act of translation is where passive information becomes something your brain actually owns. Third, apply one piece of it the next day. One small behavior change. One question you ask differently. One decision you make with the new frame. That's it. That's the whole loop. It sounds almost insultingly simple. But run that loop for 12 months and watch what happens to the quality of your decisions. Let me make this concrete. Take a mid-level project manager. Call him Daniel. 2 years ago, he started spending 20 minutes each morning on one topic, financial modeling. Not because his job required it, because he was curious. He summarized what he learned in a running document, and once a week, he looked for one place to apply it: a budget conversation, a resource allocation decision, a vendor negotiation. Nothing dramatic, just the loop, consistently. 18 months later, Daniel was leading conversations his peers weren't equipped for. His manager started pulling him into meetings outside his official scope. He received a promotion that came with a 31% salary increase. Not because he got a new degree, because he compounded a skill quietly, in the background, while everyone else was consuming without converting. And this is what a sharper mind actually does to your other assets. It makes them more efficient. The same dollar invested with better financial literacy returns more. The same network, navigated with better judgment, opens different doors. Knowledge is the multiplier sitting underneath everything else in the system. And the next asset is one where the multiplier effect is almost mathematical in its precision. Because once your knowledge is compounding, the question becomes what you do with the resources it helps you generate. That brings us to money. Specifically, what happens to it when it's sitting still. Most people think the enemy of wealth is not earning enough. It isn't. It's earned money sitting in the wrong place, doing nothing. This is the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Not because it's complicated, it's actually straightforward once you see it, but because the financial industry has very little incentive to explain it clearly. Idle money is invisible. It doesn't send you a bill. It doesn't show up as a loss on any statement. It just quietly fails to become what it could have been. And that silent failure, compounded over decades, is one of the most expensive mistakes a working professional can make. Here's the math that puts it in perspective. The average US savings account is currently paying somewhere around 0.4 to 0.6% in annual interest. A high-yield savings account gets you closer to 4.5% right now. A broad index fund tracking the S&P 500 has returned roughly 10% annually on average over the last 30 years. Those 3 numbers are not minor variations on the same theme. They are 3 completely different financial outcomes disguised as similar choices. Run the numbers, and this is what you get. $10,000 left in a standard savings account for 30 years at 0.5% becomes about $11,500. The same $10,000 in a high-yield account at 4.5% becomes $37,000. In a low-cost index fund at an average 7% real return, accounting for inflation, it becomes $76,000. Same starting amount, same 30 years. 3 completely different lives. Now let me give you a concrete example of what this looks like in practice. Meet Sandra, a 34-year-old teacher. For 6 years, she kept roughly $14,000 in a checking account because it felt safe and accessible. She wasn't careless with money. She was careful. But careful and optimized are not the same thing. That $14,000, had it been moved into a low-cost index fund at her age, would conservatively reach somewhere between $90,000 and $110,000 by retirement. Instead, it sat. It earned almost nothing. And the cost of that decision wasn't a number she ever saw on a screen, which is exactly why she never felt it until someone ran the math out loud. Every dollar you own right now is either working or it isn't. There's no neutral. Leaving money idle isn't a conservative strategy. It's a slow loss dressed up as caution. This doesn't require a financial advisor, a brokerage account with a minimum balance, or any particular level of sophistication. It requires giving every dollar a job and reviewing that assignment at least once a year. That's the whole discipline. And once your money is moving, the next question becomes who knows about it and who's in your corner when the right opportunity shows up. Because the asset that tends to unlock everything else isn't cash, it's your network. There's a hiring statistic that keeps showing up in workforce research, and it's worth pausing on. Somewhere between 70 and 80% of jobs are never publicly posted. They're filled through conversations, referrals, and relationships before a listing ever goes live, which means the professional landscape most people are competing in, the one with the job boards, and the application portals, and the tailored resumes, is already the secondary market. The primary market runs on trust, and trust compounds. Most people think of networking as a specific activity. You go to an event, collect some business cards, send a LinkedIn connection request, and hope something useful happens eventually. That model doesn't work particularly well, and most people who've tried it know it. The discomfort is real because the transaction is visible. You're clearly there to get something. Everyone in the room knows it because they're there for the same reason. Genuine network building looks almost nothing like that. It's quieter, it's slower, and it compounds in a way that formal networking never does because it's built on something formal networking can't manufacture: familiarity. Here's the mechanism. Every time you share credit publicly, every time you make an introduction that benefits someone else with no immediate return to you, every time you follow up after a conversation just to say something was useful, you make a small deposit, not into a relationship exactly, into a reputation within a relationship. Over time, those deposits build familiarity. Familiarity builds comfort, and comfort is what gets you the call before the opportunity is announced. But let me make this concrete. Take Marcus, a mid-30s supply chain analyst at a logistics firm, not a natural networker by his own description. What he did consistently was simple. Whenever he came across an article, a data point, or a market development he thought a specific contact would find useful, he sent it. No ask attached. Just thought you'd find this interesting. He did this maybe twice a month, sometimes less. 3 years in, Marcus was referred for a senior role at a competing firm by someone he had never worked with directly, only exchanged maybe a dozen messages with over 2 years. The referral came with a personal endorsement. The role paid $38,000 more annually than his current position. He got it. The person who referred him later said he did it because Marcus was the first person who came to mind when they thought of someone reliable and generous with information. That's not luck. That's a compounding account that paid out. The math on this is hard to quantify precisely, but the pattern is consistent. One warm introduction from a trusted contact can compress months of cold outreach into a single conversation. In a market where everyone has a credential and a polished profile, trust is the scarce resource. Invest in it like one. Now, all four of these assets, reputation, knowledge, money, network, share one silent accelerant that most people either underestimate or simply run out of, and that accelerant is time. There's a version of you that started investing 10 years ago. That version isn't richer because they earned more. They're richer because they waited longer. And the gap between those two versions of the same person, same income, same discipline, is not small. It's the difference between a comfortable retirement and a genuinely free one. Time is the only asset in this entire system that you cannot buy back. Every other asset here, reputation, knowledge, money, network, can be rebuilt, recovered, or grown from scratch at almost any age. Time has a hard edge. Once a year passes without your money working, that year's compounding is gone permanently, not delayed, gone. Most people understand this in theory. Very few feel it viscerally enough to act on it early. And that gap between understanding and feeling is exactly where the cost hides. Here's the math that makes it real. If you invest $300 a month starting at 25, at a 7% average annual return, you'll have roughly $914,000 by age 65. Wait until 35 to start the exact same contribution, and you end up with $443,000. Same discipline, same monthly amount. 10 years of delay cut the outcome by more than half. That missing $470,000 was never lost in a bad investment or a market crash. It was lost in a decade of waiting. That first decade isn't just important, it's doing the majority of the work. The contributions you make between 25 and 35 don't just grow. They become the base that every subsequent dollar compounds on top of. Remove that base, and the entire structure is smaller for the rest of its life. Now let me show you what this looks like for a real person. Take Kevin, a 28-year-old graphic designer who kept telling himself he'd start investing once things settled down, once the student loans were more manageable, once he got a raise, once he felt more financially stable. That moment kept moving forward. At 32, he finally opened a Roth IRA, that's an individual retirement account with tax-free growth, and started contributing $250 a month, a reasonable start. But those 4 years of waiting, from 28 to 32, cost him somewhere in the range of $160,000 in foregone compounding by retirement age. Not because he spent it, because he didn't start. The uncomfortable truth is that the market doesn't care about your reasons. It rewards presence. The investor who starts early and contributes modestly almost always outperforms the investor who starts late and contributes aggressively. Earlier beats more, almost every time. You cannot negotiate with time. You can only decide what to do with the time that's still ahead of you. And here's what changes everything once time is on your side. The engine stops needing you to push it. That's the flywheel. And once it starts spinning, it's very hard to stop. At some point, something quietly shifts. The effort you put in stops feeling proportional to the results coming out. You're not working harder, but things are moving faster. That's not motivation. That's not a lucky streak. That's a flywheel. The concept comes from mechanical engineering. A flywheel is a heavy rotating disc that's difficult to move at first. It takes real effort to get it spinning, but once it's moving, it stores its own energy. Each rotation makes the next one easier. Eventually, the wheel is generating momentum faster than any single push could explain. Jeff Bezos borrowed this idea to describe how Amazon's business model worked, and it became one of the most useful frameworks in modern business strategy. The insight transfers directly to personal finance and career building. Here's the mechanism in plain terms. A flywheel is a self-reinforcing loop where each output becomes the input for the next cycle. The keyword is self-reinforcing. You're not starting from zero each time. You're building on what the last rotation already created. Let me show you how this actually looks for someone who isn't running a tech company. Take James, a 31-year-old personal trainer. A couple of years ago, he started posting short-form videos online. 60-second clips explaining common workout mistakes. Nothing elaborate. Shot on his phone, posted 3 times a week. The first few months were quiet. Slow growth, modest engagement, easy to quit. He didn't quit. Here's what the loop looked like once it started moving. The videos brought followers. Some followers became paying clients for his online coaching program, which generated an extra $1,800 a month in revenue within the first year. That extra income funded a better camera and a modest home studio setup. Better production quality improved his content. Better content brought more followers. More followers increased his coaching inquiries. Higher demand let him raise his rates. Higher rates meant more revenue per client, which freed up time to create more content. Round and round. 2 years in, James is earning more from his online program than from his in-person sessions. He didn't launch 10 projects at once. He built one loop and let it spin. This is the part that trips most people up. The flywheel feels slow and unrewarding in the early rotations. The first few months of posting, investing, or relationship building rarely produce visible results. And most people interpret that silence as failure and stop. But stopping during the early phase is exactly backwards. That's when the wheel most needs consistent pushing. The payoff isn't in the early rotations. It's in what those early rotations make possible later. Patience in the beginning isn't passive. It's the most active investment you can make in the eventual speed of the wheel. Once the flywheel is spinning and generating its own momentum, the natural next question is what you do with what it produces. Because the smartest move isn't to spend the output, it's to stack it, deliberately, sequentially, into something that keeps building long after the original wheel started turning. That's the income waterfall. Most financial advice about multiple income streams gets one thing fundamentally wrong. It tells you to build them all at once, diversify early, run several things in parallel, spread the risk. That sounds reasonable until you try it and realize you've spread your attention so thin that nothing actually gets built. You end up with several half-finished projects and no momentum in any direction. The waterfall model is different. The idea is sequential, not parallel. You build one stream, let it stabilize, then use what it produces to fund the next one. Each layer finances the layer above it. The water doesn't flow sideways. It flows down deliberately, one level at a time. Here's why this works when parallel building doesn't. When you focus on one stream first, you can actually finish it. You learn the mechanics, iron out the problems, and get it to a point where it generates something reliable, even if that something is modest. Then, and only then, you redirect a portion of that output into building the next thing. You're not gambling your primary income on a side project. You're using the side project's own output to fund its next evolution. Let me walk you through what this looks like in practice. Take Rachel, a 36-year-old nurse working standard hospital shifts. Her primary income covers her expenses with a small amount left over each month. Not a lot of room to maneuver. So she starts small. She picks up 2 extra weekend shifts a month, generating an additional $900. She doesn't lifestyle inflate that number. Instead, she uses it to buy a refurbished professional camera for $800. She rents that camera out through a local equipment sharing platform 3 or 4 times a month at $60 a day. That generates roughly $240 a month in passive rental income. She takes that $240 and routes it directly into a low-cost index fund. Over 14 months, those contributions, combined with modest market returns, grow to around $3,600. She uses that to make an additional payment against her highest interest debt, a personal loan sitting at 11.9%. Eliminating that loan frees up $280 a month that was previously going to interest payments. That $280 a month is now available to deploy into the next asset. She uses it as the foundation for a high-yield savings account, like building toward a rental property down payment. Each layer funded the next. Nothing came from a windfall. Nothing required a dramatic lifestyle change. The waterfall doesn't require a large starting flow. It requires directing whatever flow exists with intention, rather than letting it disperse into daily spending. This is the final piece of the engine. And when you step back and look at all 7 components together, reputation, knowledge, money, network, time, the flywheel, and the income waterfall, something becomes clear that isn't obvious when you look at any single part. They don't just add up, they multiply each other. Here's what this all comes down to. Wealth isn't built by people who earn the most. It's built by people who run the best system and keep running it when nothing dramatic is happening. The 7 assets in this engine aren't separate strategies, they're one machine. Reputation opens the doors. Knowledge sharpens every decision behind them. Money, put to work early, does the heavy lifting while you sleep. Your network surfaces opportunities before they're visible to anyone else. Time is the multiplier none of the others can replace. The flywheel converts consistency into momentum, and the income waterfall turns that momentum into something that outlasts the effort that created it. What's worth noticing in your own life right now? Which of these assets is sitting idle? Which one is doing zero work because you haven't given it a job yet? You don't need to overhaul everything at once. Pick the one that's most dormant, give it one small, consistent action for the next 30 days. Not a transformation, a rotation. The wheel doesn't need a heroic push. It needs a patient one. There's a deeper question underneath all of this, though, and it's one most people never think to ask. Not how to build these assets, but what quietly erodes them without you noticing. That's worth understanding next.